Walking into the first ladder season of Diablo 2 Resurrected, we were hit with patch 2.4, which brought a massive amount of changes to builds, potential for build diversity, as well as generally changing how synergies and different skills that were underused ended up being used in that patch. Because keeping skills balanced, updating their mechanics, and overall refreshing how the game feels based off of how different character skills work is probably the easiest way for the developers to continue to change Diablo 2 moving forward. I figured it would be a good idea to take a look at the skills that currently exist, the ones that weren't touched in 2.4, and potentially looking into which skills still need to be changed for there to be better build diversity, as well as just an overall increase in the potential builds or useful skills that builds have available to them. I'd like to go class by class, looking at each skill that the class has and trying to pinpoint in on ones that I think either are completely underused or unused in their entirety, or still mechanically don't feel great, even though they might have been spruced up in the most recent patch. Now, I'm not looking to give specific numbers here because you would need to test out every change that you make to see if anything becomes overpowered or underpowered, but more so just touching on skills that mechanically have something missing or something that just doesn't quite work, and try to give some ideas of how that could be changed while keeping in mind the overall fantasy, general skill mechanics, and identity of each class. So while we're going through these classes, while I might touch on some overarching concepts, I'd like to focus on individual characters at first, because I do think that there are a lot of things that could be done to Diablo 2 to make it a better gameplay experience. That's probably too big for a single video. Starting off with Lightning Bolt. This skill tosses a lightning bolt, makes sense, right? It only takes a percentage of your overall weapon damage. It converts all of your physical damage to lightning damage, and then on top of that, adds additional lightning damage. And the major problem with Lightning Bolt is that in almost all instances, Lightning Fury is strictly better to use unless you're in a particular scenario where you have a single target that you're continuing to fire down, and for whatever reason, you're not using something like Charge Strike to very quickly kill them. So one of the first problems here is that Lightning Bolt fully converts over all of your physical damage, and because of that, the missile that you throw cannot in any way allow you to leech for life or mana. And on Lightning Fury, even though the amount is very, very small, you at least can still leech off of the initial Javelin that you throw. But for Lightning Bolt, you just can't do that. Then on top of that, it is somehow trying to convert an overwhelming amount of physical damage to an element. But when we're talking about a Javelin-based Lightning Amazon build, you really don't have physical damage on that build. Even when using something like Ethereal Titans, you're not typically buffing up any additional enhanced damage, off weapon enhanced damage. You're not using max damage charms. Converting 100% of the physical damage that you supposedly have on this build doesn't really add up to an amount that matters. And then on top of that, since it only applies a percentage of weapon damage, even if it stopped converting physical damage, you're still getting reduced effectiveness from things like cold length being applied, as well as your mana leech or life leech. So the two ideas that I have for Lightning Bolt are A, always applying 100% of the weapon damage. I think in most circumstances, you can actually remove the percentile weapon damage from every single skill, but we'll get to that more on later when there are other skills that do that. And then it also shouldn't convert the physical damage. Adding more lightning damage onto your ability that does a large amount of lightning damage is like double dipping, but not in any significant way. Lastly, I think there's something about Lightning Bolt that thematically is missing. Every other Lightning Bolt skill in the game, i.e. Lightning, Chain Lightning, and Lightning Strike, have a Lightning Bolt that automatically pierces through and hits multiple targets. If Lightning Bolt, the skill said always pierces, it would at least serve a purpose on a build, especially in the early game when you don't necessarily have 100% pierce, and you would be making the decision between throwing out Lightning Fury, which may not be piercing all the time but will hit more targets, or Lightning Bolt, which will always pierce and does more damage. So all of a sudden, depending on how the monsters are in the area around you or where you're farming, Lightning Bolt might be the better option over Lightning Fury, especially in packs that are smaller than 5 or so minions, where Lightning Fury's overall DPS increase really starts to fall off. Even if it just meant that Lightning Bolt was a ranged ability that allowed you to more effectively leech from mana and life, as well as generally being available in an earlier game build so that you're like a pseudo Lightning Fury Amazon, which typically needs to wait until level 33 or 34 before respeccing into Lightning Fury to actually be viable. While Plague Javelin had its poison length reduced, meaning that it didn't continue to absurdly scale with skill level how long the poison would be dealt over, for whatever reason, Poison Javelin still deals its damage over a massive length of time. And while this isn't necessarily some kind of game-breaking or completely useless skill type, the length of the poison means that the average damage that you're doing is so small in comparison to Plague Javelin that while you can arguably increase your DPS by hitting more monsters while Plague Javelin's on cooldown, the damage from Poison Javelin is just so pitiful that in most circumstances it's kind of useless to use. I like the idea of Poison Javelin being a more concise, more accurate, and smaller damage source than Plague Javelin, so that Poison Javelin builds continue to have something to do in between the cooldown of Plague Javelin. If Poison Javelin's poison length could be reined back a little bit or not scale so aggressively with skill level, then the amount of damage that you're doing per second with it would be a lot more reasonable and instigate a lot more of this skill use rather than just something additionally to throw out or to use until you have Plague Javelin. Valkyrie is a really interesting skill, and I'd argue it's one of the hallmarks of the identity of the Amazon herself. But with the way that the synergies work for it and also the overall AI of the Valkyrie, while it looks like something that you could build as a primary skill, not only can you not actually do that successfully, but even if you were to fully invest all the points into it, you would end up getting a summon that is just a much worse version of an Act 2 mercenary with almost no benefits to speak of. So just to give you an idea, with the 6 synergies that Valkyrie has and the skill itself, that means that you would need 140 points to fully empower a Valkyrie summon. Now, if you're not aware, you don't have 140 skill points even at level 99, and doing this would mean that you literally had nothing else to use to put into a single additional skill, so your Amazon would literally just be sitting behind a Valkyrie. If the Valkyrie was incredibly powerful, that wouldn't be a problem. But not only is she generally weak, but her AI decision making and her overall attack speed and movement speed makes her nearly useless, other than proactively summoning as a meat shield while you are playing throughout the game. I sometimes only put a point into Valkyrie so that my Peace rune word will stop summoning Valkyries that die within a second, because if you don't actually have points in this skill, if you summon a Valkyrie from Peace rune word, she dies immediately. So the first idea that I have for Valkyrie is that, similar to an Iron Golem, she shouldn't despawn when summoned, and you would actually be able to specifically target a spear type weapon to summon her from. Now, so that she doesn't lose all of her functionality, if you don't target an item on the ground, you would just be able to summon her like normal. But for people who don't know, the Valkyrie actually equips a set of gear that draws from a magic and rare pool of items that can roll with a lot of different affixes. You have no way of controlling or seeing the gear that a Valkyrie is wearing. With this idea, you'd be able to specifically target a spear item, and the Valkyrie would equip that as their weapon. And then after that, she would continue to equip rare gear in the rest of her slots. For people who wanted to really invest in the Valkyrie, at the very least giving her 20 skill points and 20 skill points into decoy so that she has the most life possible, as well as bumping up her resistances. You'd be able to give her a very strong weapon. So as long as you keep the Valkyrie alive, you might be able to select for specific attack modifiers on the weapon or different stats to be able to increase the overall damage that she could output. And then another idea that was proposed was the idea of actually changing her synergies so that instead of working with penetrate, critical strike, and dodge, or any of those skills, you would instead synergize with fend, impale, and jab, and then she would use those skills to attack as well. Then the Valkyrie could just be used as a chump tank for any build that's looking to get a little bit of additional survivability. Melee, spear, and javelin zons could generate another serious source of overall damage output to help bump up their viability as well. The first thing to note in the bow and crossbow skills are the first 3 starter skills for each tree, namely Fire Arrow, Magic Arrow, and Cold Arrow. Each one of these skills will convert your physical damage over to the element of the skill, and Fire Arrow and Cold Arrow will actually add attack rating and additional elemental damage, whereas Magic Arrow will add attack rating, and physical damage, which would then be converted. The problem with these 3 skills, other than magic arrow having the slight additional bonus of not using arrows and bolts, you never use these skills later on. I think one way that you could actually manage to have these skills be relevant even in the later game is if they fully converted all physical damage over to the element. In this way, you could build a fully competent physical damage build, and with only 100 points between cold arrow and its synergy, fire arrow and its synergy, and then magic arrow, you could have a tri-elemental build that is able to rely on physical damage and, when necessary, swap over to a different element and continue to put out a high amount of damage, but have that versatility in being able to handle just about any immune in the game. Looking at Ice Arrow itself, while it seems like it's bringing something more to the table than the Cold Arrow is, and is somehow a step between this and Freezing Arrow, the way that it works currently is the exact same way as Freezing Arrow, except Freezing Arrow explodes on impact and deals damage in an AoE. Once you have access to Freezing Arrow, there is literally no reason to be using Ice Arrow. Right now, if they were to change it so that Ice Arrow actually carried more cold damage than Freezing Arrow, but continued to only be applicable to single targets, it's something that you could legitimately swap to for single targets and boss kill speed over Freezing Arrow, but each one of these 2 attacks would still have its overall identity and have its different use cases. Whereas right now, you would never not use Freezing Arrow because the damage output from Ice Arrow will never compare to Freezing Arrow even against single targets. And while this one isn't a direct change to Exploding Arrow itself, it's more so a change to how easy it is to get into Exploding Arrow in the early late game. Right now, Exploding Arrow is arguably one of the best starter skills because of how much damage you can get out just from having a 3-socketed hunter's bow with a couple rubies in it, considering this will explode on impact and you don't need to hit. That being said, in the later game, getting into a really powerful Exploding Arrow build actually takes an incredible amount of gear for it to be anywhere near as competitive as Freezing Arrow. And the major reason for this is that the Amazon set, the Mavina's set, has both flat cold damage on it, which will actually add to the explosion of Freezing Arrow, and it carries plus percentile cold damage when you wear the entire set. Add on to that, that it's just a really good set for a Boazon if you are specifically spec'd into Freezing Arrow. Basically means that the benefits that you get from it are in no way parodied if you're using Exploding Arrow or Immolation Arrow. So if Mavina's set also said a plus flat fire damage to be able to add onto the explosion from Exploding Arrow, as well as +2 fire skill damage. So while I'd argue that Exploding Arrow could see some buffs and feel better, honestly, the endgame version of a Fire Boazon is actually very strong, and I just think being able to get into an early endgame viable fire build is the easiest way to fix Exploding Arrow, and by extension, Immolation Arrow. Also, if you're wondering where we generally came up with these ideas, I was actually sitting with chat. I stream every day, Monday through Friday, on twitch.tv/macrobioboy. Right up there, you can check it out. Come hang out. It's really nice to be able to bounce these ideas off the community, get different opinions, because I'm not the only person who plays this game, and potentially come up with better ideas, or make sure that we're not missing out on any skills that still need some love. So let me know what you think. Are there some skills that we didn't cover here that absolutely need to be re-looked at if we're trying to help foster better build diversity, better inclusion of skills, and generally up the overall power of different classes? Or is the Amazon already way too busted? We need to completely leave her alone? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. Also, if you think that we touched on any skills, but we missed something or we didn't quite hit the mark, let me know as well. There's some world where if enough people believe that certain changes are required, maybe we'll see them in the next patch, and it'd be really nice to be able to positively impact that and just kind of push these ideas out into the wild and see if any of them stick. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you're looking forward to the next class that we cover, which will be the Assassin, and I look forward to seeing you in that video.